When I edit my images, I find myself breaking it down into 4 steps, and this is part of my workflow. So the first stage is I will identify areas that need darkening, and I will darken those down. The second will be to find areas in the image that need lightening up a little bit, and I'll lighten those. Then I'll add contrast in the third stage, and then the fourth stage I will look at the image and I'll pick little areas, only if they need it, but there may be areas that then need a little bit more lightening or darkening, or they may need some very selective contrast added to them. So these are the 4 main steps that make up a very large part of my editing process, and I find I can do all of those adjustments with curves adjustment layers. I find they're absolutely fantastic. I can apply these, I can come back to them, I can change it, I can mask in and out, so it's all totally non-destructive, and I'm not stuck with the first decision that I've made with that edit. So in today's video, we're going to jump into Photoshop and I'll run you through those 4 steps, and I'll show you how I achieve each one via a curves adjustment layer. Let's jump into Photoshop and I'll show you guys how it's done. So once you have your image open in Photoshop, you're going to need your layers palette open. So this is the layers palette here. If yours is not open, just come up to Window and then come down to Layers and click on that, and that'll open your layers palette. Now we will need the toolbar as well. This should default to being open, but once again, if that's not open, just come up to Window and come down to Tools down the bottom there. Okay, but that normally always defaults to being open. So before we start adding adjustment layers to this image, we want to duplicate the layer. So Command J will duplicate it, and then all of our adjustment layers will then be affected to this layer, not the underneath layer. Just gives us a bit of extra security, where if we don't like what we've done, we want to start again, we can delete that layer. Or we can flatten some of our adjustments onto this layer itself and still preserve the background layer underneath. Righto, so we're ready to add our first curves adjustment layer. So there's a couple of different ways of doing this, but look, honestly, the quickest way is to come down here in the layers palette and just click on this little icon here, and this will bring up all of the adjustment layers that are available. So click on curves and you'll see it's added another layer here on top. So this is our curves adjustment on the left, and what it does is it automatically adds a mask. So at the moment the mask is white, so just remember with a mask, white reveals, black conceals. So every adjustment we make over here is going to be visible. Now just a quick little run through the curves palette here in case you're not familiar with the curves palette. It's pretty simple. What we see here is a histogram of all of our tones, and this line here, if you can imagine this end here being black and the top end here being pure white, and in the middle is mid-grey. So if we grab that curve and push it upwards, it's going to lighten our image, and if we push down, it's going to darken our image. Now another thing when you're learning is you might want to just rename these layers, because we're going to end up with about 4 layers on here. So if we just double click on that, let's go darken first. So we're going to rename this layer darken. So we want to darken this image, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to darken it. We're going to mask the whole lot out, and then we're going to brush that adjustment in. So the trick here is to go a little bit overboard, so go a little bit more than what you would normally sort of like or want. So let's just grab this in the middle here, and we want to pull down, and I'm pulling down towards the right hand bottom corner. So I'm not grabbing it and pulling straight down. Sometimes if you do that, you can, or if you go sideways, you can get a color shift. So I like to sort of go on that 45. And so with this particular image, all I'm going to do is I'm going to darken a little bit in the sky and a bit of that foreground. So let's leave them there. So as you can see, there's a lot here that we don't want darkened. So we come over to the mask, just click on the mask, and we're going to invert that. So that's Command I will fill that with black. And that is effectively now masked out all of that darkening that we did. So we now need to brush that in. So to brush that in, there's a couple of things you need to know here. First, we just come down to our foreground and background color. That needs to be on black and white. If it's not, if you have a color selected here, then you can quickly change it by just hitting D on the keyboard. So that'll change it to black and white. And then to toggle between black and white, you can hit X on the keyboard. Okay, so we want to paint in white because we want to reveal the adjustment underneath this mask. So we need to have our foreground color set to white. And now we need to select our brush tool. So the shortcut for that on the keyboard is B. So you can see here on the toolbar, I've now selected a brush. Just quickly come out on the fly out on that. You want to make sure that you are on the brush tool, not the pencil tool. So make sure you're on brush. It should default to that unless you have been using the pencil tool. And then we need to come up just to the top along here and make a couple of settings. So if we just click down here, we can select an actual brush. Along this bar here will be brushes that you have used. And then in here, you've got folders of different types of brushes. So if you haven't selected one before, just go to General, select a general brush, and then you just need to make sure that the hardness is on 0. So that means that there is no hardness and it's a soft edged brush, and that's what we want. This slider here controls the size of the brush, but I'll show you a shortcut for that, so don't bother too much about that. And the other thing you need to do is you need to come up to here, and we want to reset the opacity. So normally this will default to 100% opacity and your flow will be 100. We want to knock that down because we don't want it, we want to just gently brush it in. So I like to work on fairly low numbers, so I sort of gently brush it in. So here I reckon that'll be fine. And on the flow we'll keep that to about, about halfway is fine. So now when we hover over the image, you can see my brush is here. So this is quite small. Now there's two ways, I'll show you two quick ways to increase the size of your brush. One is just with the brackets on your keyboard. So the two brackets next to the P key. So the right hand one will increase the size and the left hand one will decrease. Now you can do it on the fly with holding down the Control Alt on a PC or Control Option on a Mac. And then if you click and drag to the right, then your brush gets bigger, and you click and drag to the left, it gets smaller. Just be careful because if you drag down, that changes the hardness. So we want to leave the hardness at 0 and just change the diameter. So as I said, I want to brush in the sky here. I want to darken just a little bit sort of in this area here. And I just want to darken a bit of this foreground down. So we just click and drag across. As you can see, now I don't want to darken the light out, so I'm just coming in from the edges. Be really careful doing a sky because it can sometimes get a bit patchy. And I've got a darker patch here that's naturally darker. So I'll probably just keep away from that a little bit. I don't want to go overboard with this. So that's probably maybe a little bit more in the top there. And let's just darken this foreground down here. And you have to remember with your workflow that you got to remember contrast. So when you add contrast, that's going to darken and lighten as well. So you don't want to go overboard with your darkening, and this is where your workflow comes into place, and this is why I darken, lighten first, and then add my contrast. Okay, so that's looking pretty good, I reckon, for darkening. Now, so it's very subtle. I don't want to go overboard with this. We can turn that layer on and off, and you'll just see what we've actually done. So there you can see we've just darkened that sky down a little bit and just darkened the foreground down. Righto, next up I want to lighten part of this image. So this area through here, I want to lighten that up, and just this patch through here. And I like to lighten the sort of center parts of an image, sort of where the interest is, just to lead the viewer in. So we want to lead them into this image, and by darkening and lightening we can create that depth. So again, we just come down to this little icon down here and we add another curves adjustment, and you can see it's added another layer. And this time lighten is obviously the opposite to darken, where we just click in the middle and we just drag up. So we go a little bit more than we want, I reckon to about there. And then again, Command I to invert that. And now I need to select a smaller brush, and I'm going to just zoom in a little bit, move these palettes, and my opacity and everything's still the same. And now just click through here, lighten that lighthouse a little bit. So I'm just lightening in underneath here, and then I'll just make that brush a little bit bigger and just a little bit of a lighten through here. Okay, and that's about all I want to do there. Let's just turn that on and off and have a look. Yep. So as you can see, that's made quite a difference to that whole image. It's now drawing us into the lighthouse and the rocks. We've got a little bit more light on there and a bit more depth. So that's looking fine. Now, next adjustment will be contrast. So again, we just apply another curves layer. Now, this time I just want to show you two different ways. So there's some presets here, and look, I quite like this one here. I want to add quite a bit of contrast. I quite like the strong contrast, and then I'll just brush it in lightly. So you've got a couple of options there. If you just want to go a little bit, we've got medium and light. And all of these contrasts, it's always an S curve. So if you want to create your own, just get rid of these points. You just click on them and drag them out. So you can create your own. You can either put 2 points in here and lift this one and drop that one, or sometimes some people like to have a point in the middle to sort of hold your midpoints. And all we're doing is contrast is just making the darks darker and the lights lighter. Okay, so let's do a manual one. You guys, you know, every image is a little bit different. You need to just sort of do what you're happy with. And remember, we're going to brush this in, so don't be scared to go a little bit overboard, a little bit more than what you would normally do. So I reckon that's fine. Let's now invert that mask, so Command I. You see we've filled that mask now, so we're not seeing any of that adjustment. And just select a slightly bigger brush, and I'm just going to brush contrast into the interesting area. So I actually want to put a little bit in the sky and across the lighthouse, because that will help actually darken these areas here. And I definitely want it in here, and maybe just a little bit in this pool to bring that up. A little bit more in here. Okay, so let's have a look at that. Yep, so you can see where it's just added that contrast. Now I'll give you a little tip. What happens is when you add contrast, it will increase your color saturation. So sometimes this is a good thing, sometimes it's not. So if you've added contrast and it's really boosted the saturation of your image and you don't like it, what you do is you go to that curves adjustment layer, and we come up here to the blending mode and we change it to luminosity. So when it's on luminosity, it'll only change the darker and the lighter values. So you can see here now it's the same adjustment, but it's just made it darker. It's just, well, darker and lighter. It's added the contrast, but it hasn't affected the color. If I flick that back to normal, now you'll see when I turn that on and off that it's actually added quite a bit of punch there in the color. Now, one last adjustment layer, and this is where quite often what I will do now is once I get to this stage, I may need to go into one little area and then just adjust that. So with this particular image, I want to actually come into the lighthouse and just lighten it up a little bit because it's just looking a little bit dark up in here. So we'll make an adjustment just for that and maybe just lighten this building a little bit, and that'll really help our subject stand out a little bit more. So it's just a lighten one, but instead of coming back to this one here, which is our second one, we're going to make a specific one for this area. So what you're best to do is just zoom into that area so you can see it a little bit better, and we just add our curves layer. Okay, and you can actually target specific colors. So on this properties panel, if you click this fella here and then come across, and we'll pick so the sort of the lighter tone, and you'll see that's placed a point on my curves graph. So that was the lighter tone, and then maybe the darker tone in here. So that gives me now 2 points, the dark point and the light point, that I can work with. So I can then, we want to increase those. We may actually want to put one in the middle, and if we pull these, it'll actually leave that darker tone where it is. But you've got to be careful because sometimes you can get color shifts. Okay, so that's probably pretty good there. Let's lighten that area up. So we just invert that mask and just go back to the brush tool. And this needs to be a lot smaller. And this is where sometimes you do want to sort of zoom right in and make your brush a little bit smaller. And then we can just paint in here. I actually have a tablet. I'm going to use a tablet. Now we can just turn that on and off to see what we're actually doing. So it's very subtle. Let's make this, let's lighten this guy here up a bit. So you do, on the lighthouse, you do only want to be working in the lighthouse, not the clouds outside. Let's just lighten that up a bit. Okay, let's have a look at that. Yeah, so if we just take our picture back to normal size, let's turn that on and off. So there you go, that's a very subtle change, but it's these little subtle changes that makes the image what it is in the end. So that's just adding a little bit more light on the subject there. So there you go, we've got 4 layers. So darken, lighten, contrast, and then selective lightning. And that's basically all I do. Now, I just want to show you the beauty of having these layers is that this is all totally non-destructive. We can come back to, let's say, this darken layer here. So if we looked at this and sort of said to ourselves, oh, I think I didn't really darken, you know, the sky and everything enough at the start. Well, we come back to that layer. Just remember, this is our mask. This is our adjustment. So when we click on the adjustment, you can see that that palette comes up and we can actually change it. So we can make it darker. So it's still applying the same mask. So the areas aren't changing, but of course this is. So we can just darken that down a little bit. And then the beauty with a mask is that this is non-destructive as well. So we've painted in white, so you can see at the top of this mask is white where we've painted that effect in. And any area that we don't like that we've painted in, we can paint it out by changing our brush to black. And let's just paint in, this will go lighter. Okay, so I'm painting black back into where white was, which is concealing that area. So it's totally adjustable, totally non-destructive. You can come back and you can change things, you know, later on. You're not tied to your first adjustments, and this is why I love these adjustment layers. Righto, so look, that's about it. Just one last little thing. Let me just get a history panel up, and we'll just have a look at it before and after, just to show you the difference. So that's what we started with. As you can see, it's all fairly flat, as raw files always are, and that's what we're finished with. And don't forget, I did actually take that bit of sky out, but there you go, quite a bit of difference. And you can actually see the subject there is really standing out nicely now. So there you go. Now, one other thing, and that is we've got a layered file now. So if you want to save this, it has to be a TIFF or a PSD file. So you can't save it as a JPEG, because JPEGs don't allow layers. So if we go to save this, as I say, it'll either be a PSD, a Photoshop file, or you need to select a TIFF file. I keep everything as TIFF files, and then it'll show you one other step. So come in here, if you have LZW ticked, then that'll add a bit of compression. It saves you about 20% on your file size without losing any quality. So that's how we then save that layered file, and we can come back and then, you know, tweak any of these at any stage. And I suggest you probably save it as a layered file while you're learning. Now, one other thing that you'll probably want to know is, what if we want to retain these layers, but now I want to add like a layer on top of sharpening, or the other thing I might want to do is sometimes I will add a vignette. So we can stamp all of these layers and actually put a stamped layer on top. So I'll just show you how to do that. So to create a stamped layer, you need to hold down quite a few things. So hold down the Shift key, and then the Alt key if you're on a PC, or the Option key if you're on a Mac, and then hold down the Command key, and then press E on the keyboard. So if you forget what that is, I just basically hold down everything you can and hit E, and you'll eventually work out which one it is. So we've now created a stamped layer. So this is a layer containing everything that is underneath it, and I could now add some sharpening to that layer, or I could add a vignette. So there you go. That is curves adjustment layers, my absolute favorite thing to do in Photoshop, my favorite technique for editing. There's so many things you can do with it. It's just that one thing, but as you can see, we can darken, we can lighten, we can add contrast. We could remove contrast if we want. We can just take one small area and work on it specifically. It also, you know, by adding the contrast, it has boosted our color. So it's really 90% of your editing. I find once I've done, you know, those 4 levels, those 4 different things, darken, lighten, contrast, and then work on selective areas, normally 9 times out of 10, there's nothing else I need to do. I'm basically done. I'll add a sharpening layer, and then maybe a vignette, and you're good to go. So there you are. I hope you enjoyed that. Have a go at it, have a play, save it as a TIFF file, keep those layers, just practice coming back to it, making those adjustments. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed that and you get a lot out of it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya. Bye.